Begin today at the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Beis. Zog the Heilige Mishnah. Hareini Nazir k'sheyili ben. Person says, I'll be a Nazir when I give birth to a son. V'noilad le ben, and he has a son. Hareza Nazir, he becomes a Nazir. Noilad loi bas, if he gives birth to a daughter, or tumtum, vandregenis. Tumtum is when you can't see any simonim, if it's a zachar or a nekeva. Androgenis is when there's both simonim, zachar and nekeva. So it's not clear if it's a son or a daughter, so then ain't a Nazir. He will not be a Nazir. And the point here is that you don't say that it's a suffix if he's a Nazir or not, because you don't know if it's a zachar or a nekeva. He only accepted upon himself Naziros if it's for sure a ben. But a tumtum and androgenis, which is not a ben, is not a zachar. Is not a Nazir, that is. If a person says kishiyi vlad, when I'll have a child, so he didn't specify zachar or nekeva or ben or a bas, so then afilu neulei bas, he gives birth to a daughter, a tumtum, vandregenis, harez a Nazir, he becomes a Nazir because he had a vlad, he had a child. Talk to Mishnah, pila ishtai, what happens if a person's wife miscarried after he said that he's only going to be a Nazir if he has a vlad, so now she miscarried. So the pshat according to most Rishonim here is that she gave birth to a child which was alive, and then afterwards the child passed away. And it's a suffix. It's not clear if the child that was born was a viable child, elamai something happened afterwards and the child passed away, or the child that was born passed away because really he was never a viable child. So then he would not be a Nazir. So ain't a Nazir. So in such a case he's not a Nazir because we said vlad. If the child was born, right, but if the child was born, so the halacha is that the child that's born and he wasn't after 9 months, and the child was born in a way that he couldn't live b'chlal, that's not called a vlad, because he's not a bar kayama b'chlal. So it's not clear what happened, why the child passed away. Did he pass away because he was never a bar kayama b'chlal, or did he pass away because something else happened? So it's a suffix. So if it's a suffix, it's not a Nazir. The Gemara will explain why, if in the case that it's a suffix, he's not a Nazir. Rab Shimon says that in a case that's a suffix, you have to be machmer. And therefore, Yaimar, what he should say is, Im haya ben kayama, if the child was a viable child, so hareani nazir chayva. So then, I'm a Nazir because it's an obligation. I took already upon myself. If I have a child, I'll be a Nazir. Ve'im lav, if it was not a viable child, hareani nazir nedava. So I accept upon myself now, I donate now. In other words, right now I accept upon myself a nazirus. The reason why he has to say this according to Rab Shimon is because he has to bring a carbon. So even though Rab Shimon holds regarding the Naziris itself, you have to be machmeh either way to keep your Naziris, because it might be that your condition was fulfilled, but when it comes to bringing the carbon, it's going to be a suffix. If your carbon is being brought into the Azara and it's a carbon, or it's chulin. So therefore you should say this condition here, or you should add this and say that if I'm not a Nazir because the child was not viable, I'm accepting upon myself now Naziris. Sagt der Mishnah weiter, Chazra v'yalda. What happens if after his wife miscarried the first time, now she gave birth a second time to a viable child? Harez a Nazir. So he'll be a Nazir and he'll keep Naziris one time for the obligation he has that he accepted upon himself to be a Nazir when he has a child. So according to the Tanakama, it's simple. The first child that was born, because it's not clear if it was a viable child or not, so for that there's no obligation for Naziris at all. Now when the second child is born, which is a viable child, so now you keep the Naziris for this child. So one Naziris according to the Tanakama. Rab Shimon, however, according to Rab Shimon says that there's a suffix here. Just like regarding the first child that was born, so Rab Shimon says, since there's a suffix if it was a viable child or not, so therefore you have to keep Naziris, and you have to add and say, either the Naziris I'm keeping is for the obligation I have, because it was a viable child, or you say that I'm going to donate now another Naziris, I'm making now another Naziris in case it was not a viable child and it's not my original obligation. So now, according to Rab Shimon, when a second child is born, so now you have another suffix over here. The suffix continues regarding the second child. This second child, do you have to keep Naziris for this second child because the first child was not viable, and this second child is really that obligation you have to keep Naziris? Or maybe no, maybe the first child was a healthy child, was a viable child, and then the second child now is not a child that you're obligated to keep Naziris. So again, the suffix comes up regarding the second child. So what do you have to do? So Rab Shimon says, Yaimar, what the person should say is, Ima Rishaim ben Kayama, if the first child born was a viable child, and that was the real Naziris. So Harishan Chayva, Vizu Nedava. So the first Naziris you kept for the first child, that's your real obligation. And Vizu Nedava. For the second child, you're accepting upon yourself now a Nedava to keep another Naziris. Vimlav, but if the first child was not viable, so then what that means is that the Naziris you kept for the first child was not your real original Naziris that you said that I'll keep if I have a child born. It wasn't a viable child. So Harisha Nidava, so then the first child, for him, you're keeping a new Naziris, which is just a donation that you're voluntarily donating now. And Vizu Chayva, and now for the second child that was born, that was healthy and that was viable, this is going to be your obligation of Naziris. So the same suffix continues and carries down also in a situation when you had a second viable child, according to Rab Shimon. What's the chiddush of the first case of the Mishnah? The first case of the Mishnah was a person says, I'll be a Nazir when I have a ben. The Mishnah said, and he had a ben, he had a son, and he's going to be a Nazir. What's the chiddush? So the Gemara answers Mishum Seifa. The chiddush is the next case of the Mishnah says. The Reisha Tak is not a chiddush. What's the chiddush in the next case? Bas, Tumtum, Vandregenis. When it says that if he had a daughter or a tumtum and androgenes, it's not clear if it's zachar or nekeva, then he will not be a nazir. But isn't that also obvious if he said, if I have a son and he did not have a son, that he's not going to be a nazir? Obviously, he didn't have a son. Answers the Gemara, I would think, when he says, if I'll have a son, maybe the term ben does not mean a son, but maybe ben means when I will be built, which refers to the fact when I'll have a child, whether a zachar, whether a nekeva. So maybe he would be a nazir even if he did not have a zachar, even if he had a bas or a tumtum and adregenis. That's why the Mishnah is saying that no, we taich ben literally. That's the lashon that people use. Ben means a son. If he had a daughter or something else, he's not going to be a nazir. Now, so the Mishnah says if he said I'll have a vlad, so then even if he had a bas or a tumtum and andregenis, he will be a nazir. So pshita, that's obvious as well because he had a vlad. So again, the Gemara says, I would maybe think to say, Vlad, the mechshev beni inshi binan. Maybe Vlad means a child that will be born and that will be chashev amongst people. He can go out and be amongst people. And some Rishonim say that the svara here would be that that's only a son, only a ben that could be amongst people, but not necessarily a daughter or not a tumtum vandregenis. Others say that the Gemara is saying that maybe I would say a ben could be amongst men and a bas could be amongst women, but a tumtum and androgenis, so maybe that is not a child that could be a regular person amongst people, and therefore that's not included in the term vlad. Kamash Malam, that's why the Mishnah is saying that no, the term vlad does include even a tumtum and androgenis. When it says in the Mishnah here that if the person said, "I'll have a child, I'll be a nazir," and then his wife miscarried, so he's not a nazir. In other words, like I said before, even though it's not clear what happened here, the child was born alive, but then when the child passed away, it's not clear if the child was a viable child or not, and the Mishnah says he's not a nazir. Man Katani law, who is the Tana of the Mishnah that says that we're lenient and he doesn't have to be a Nazir? Rabbi Yehuda, the Kri who? This is Rabbi Yehuda that was quoted already earlier in the Masechta, in the Braise regarding a Kri, which over there, the Gemara said, Rabbi Yehuda says, what happens if a person says, I'll be a Nazir if this pile of grain has in it a certain amount? And then you come to the pile and you see that someone stole from it or got lost, and you don't know if it had that amount or not. Basically, it's a suffix if his condition was fulfilled or not. Rabbi Yehuda says in the case where it's a suffix, if it was fulfilled, we're mekel. You're not a nazir. Same thing over here. Rabbi Yehuda says we're mekel and you're not a nazir. Yoimar, that in such a case we actually have to be machmer. Rab Shimon holds anytime there's a suffix, if your naziris took effect, you have to be machmer, and therefore Yoimar, you should say im hoye ben kayama hareni nazar chayve. If the child born was a ben kayama, so I'm obligated to be a nazir. Vim lav, if the child born was not a ben kayama hareni nazar nedava. So then I will donate now to be a nazir. So then the carbon that it'll bring will for sure be a carbon for a nazir. Rabab asked from Rav Huna the following shaila. Person says, "Areni nazir k'shiyili ben." I'll be a nazir when I'll have a son, and then v'pilo ishtai, his wife miscarried, like the case of our Mishnah. But then what happened is v'hifrish carbon. He right away went and separated an animal to be for a carbon for his nazirus. Now we're talking here about a nazirus that didn't even necessarily take effect. But he went and he was mafresh a korban. Then v'chazra v'yolda, and then afterwards his child gave birth. His wife gave birth to a second child. Mahu. What's going to be the halacha now? Yeah, so according to most Rishonim, according to most Rishonim, the pshat here is that his wife gave birth to a second child, which was a twin, exactly on the same day. The first child that was born passed away, and he was mafresh a korban. Then she gives birth to a second child, and that second child was alive, was a viable child. So now, what's going to be the halacha in such a case? So what's the shaila over here? So according to, who are we asking this question? According to Rabbi Yehuda, that says that you have to be mekel by Naziris when it's unclear if the Tanai took effect or not, or according to Rab Shimon. So the Gemara explains. According to who are we asking this question? If we're asking according to Rab Shimon that we just learned, that Rab Shimon is machmer, mighty boyle. What's the question, B'chlal? Ha'amar Rab Shimon always says, Safik Naziris lahachmer. That any time you have a Naziris, and it's a suffix if the Tanai that you took effect or not, so you have to be machmer. So over here, even after the first child was born, even though it's not clear if he was a viable child or not, you have to be machmer that it's a good Naziris. So it's not negated to know because of the second child or that was born afterwards or not. Okay, so the Gemara explains, Ve'elo alibe de Rabbi Yehuda. The question here is according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Omar, Rabbi Yehuda said, Safik Naziris lahakol, that by a Safik Naziris you have to be mekel, so here the question is, what's going to be the halacha with this behemoth that you were makdish as a korban for the Naziris? Kadosh or like Kadosh? Will this animal be hektish or not? And the question basically is, do I say that since the first child that was born passed away, so we don't even know if it was a viable child, so we have to be mekel, and therefore the behemoth is not kadosh? Or maybe I should say, now that the second child was born, and the second child did live, doesn't that maybe prove that the first child was a viable child? Because they were twins, they were born on the same day. Why is a child not a viable child when he's born? Because he was born maybe not with a full pregnancy, it wasn't a proper birth, so therefore the child wasn't viable. But the fact that the second child was born and lived, maybe that should be good enough to prove that the first child was a viable child, and therefore the behemoth that he was makdish as a korban is kadosh. Okay, so the Gemara is asking this shaila specifically beneged to the korban, beneged to the Naziris itself. The fact that a second child was born and was viable is not going to be enough to make the Naziris a Naziris. That Rabbi Yehuda holds that we're still going to be mekel and is not going to be a Naziris. But the shaila is beneged to the behemoth if it has kedusha or not. So the Gemara explains, "My nafkemina." So what's the relevance to know if the behemoth has kedusha or not? The nafkemina is pashat ligizasai velavid boy, a behemoth that's hektish. So the question is, are you allowed to shear its wool, to use its wool for yourself, or velavid boy, or to work with it, to use it, to work with it? That's what the nafkemina would be. Right? So in other words, the shaila over here is, when you makdish this behemoth, it's not clear if the Naziris took effect when you will makdish the behemoth for that Naziris, does the hektish of the behemoth take effect or not? Okay, so the Gemara says, Teiku, this remains a suffix, and the Gemara doesn't answer the shaila.
Is also a twin?
Again, what? In the Mishnah? I don't think so. Not that I know of. Over there, when it's not a twin, for sure, there shouldn't be no issue. B'chlal. Okay. The Gemara has another shaila. Boye minei ben Rechumi me Abaye. Ben Rechumi asked a question from Abaye. This name Ben Rechumi is interesting. It's the only place in Shas where such a name is mentioned. Some say that this name Ben Rechumi is related to the Abaye itself that he asked, as we'll see soon here. So what was the shaila? Hareini Nazir l'kishiyeli ben. Person says, I'll be a Nazir when I'll have a son. Right? His friend heard what he said, and he says, Ve'olai, and upon myself the same. So what does this mean? What did he mean to say when he said Ve'olai? Adibure mashma? Does it mean that he's taking upon himself the same thing that his friend said, which means that when your friend is going to give birth to a son, you're going to become a Nazir. You're saying that I'm going to be a Nazir just like what you said. Or he's accepting upon himself the same thing that his friend accepted upon himself. Just like his friend accepted upon himself that when he will give birth to a son, he will become a Nazir. So when you heard this, you're accepting upon yourself the same thing, that if you have a son, then you will be a Nazir. If you're going to say that when you say ve'olai, what that means is that you're taking upon yourself that if you have a son, then you're going to become a Nazir. So Omar Hareini Nazir, the Kishiyaheli Ben. If you heard your friend saying, I'll be a Nazir when I have a son, And the friend heard va'amar va'ani, and I will also be va'ani. He didn't say va'alai, but he said va'ani. So mahu, what does that lashon of va'ani mean? Anafshei ka'amar. Does the term va'ani mean that you're taking the same upon yourself? Just like your friend said that when he has a son, he'll be a Nazir. You're taking upon yourself that when you will have a son, you will also be a Nazir. Or maybe when you said va'ani, what you meant to say is rachimna lach kevasech. I love you like yourself, just like you. When you're going to have a son, you're going to be so happy about this, and that's why you're accepting upon yourself to be a Nazir when you have a son. So too, I'll be a Nazir just like you when you have a son. Furthermore, the Gemara says the question here is, if you're going to say, regarding this shaila here, when you say this after your friend said, if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir, and you're saying, and me as well, so if you're going to say that over there, call ba'an pei, if you're saying this in front of your friend, so what did you mean to say? You meant to say if he has a son, not if you will have a son, because ksifule milsa, the fact that your friend is saying such a thing, it would be embarrassing for you not to participate in his simcha. He's anticipating to give birth to a son, and therefore he is accepting upon himself that if I have a son, I'll become a Nazir. So if you're saying this in front of your friend, so mistama, what you meant to say is, I'm also so excited that if you'll have a son, I'll be a Nazir like you. So that's what we'll say if you said it in front of your friend when he's talking about himself having a son. But how about the following case? You heard your friend saying that I will be a Nazir if Pliny has a son. He didn't say if I have a son. Your friend was saying that I'll be a Nazir if someone else has a son. And you, your friend, you heard what he said. And now you said I as well. So what does this va'ani mean? Mahu. What does this mean? Mi amrinon. Do I say shaloi b'fanov, because you're accepting upon yourself an Nazirus, and it's not after this person said that if he has a son, he'll be a Nazir. He accepted if someone else has a son as a Nazir. So that's someone else. You're not in front of him. You don't have to demonstrate and show your happiness that he's going to have a son b'chlal. It's not in front of him b'chlal. So anafshei kamar, you were saying this for yourself, that if I will have a son, then I will be a Nazir. Or maybe even in this case, we say as well that this is what you were saying. I love that person just like you love that person, and you accept it upon yourself to be a Nazir when he will have a son. So I'm saying the same thing, and I love that person also the same way, and I'll be a Nazir if he has a son. So Tiboy, this remains a question. This is the lashon in the Gemara in Nazir or Nadarim. We had also a few times. Tiboy is just like Teiku. Just before we had in the Gemara Teiku, but here the Gemara uses the lashon Tiboy. Remains in Ibaya. Zok Heilige Mishneh, Hareini Nazir. A person says, I'll be a Nazir. So that's the first thing. So, okay, so he's going to be a Nazir. But then he said a second thing, Vin Nazir, and I'll also be a Nazir again, Kishayili Ben, when I'll have a son. So he accepted upon himself Nazirus twice. First, Stam, to be a Nazir without any conditions, but then a Nazir if he has a son. So now his Chol Mayne Shaloi, he began counting his own Nazirus, not in connection to the son, but it is the first Nazirus he accepted upon himself, and V'achakach Noilad Loi Ben, and then he has a son. So Mashlim es Shaloi, he completes keeping his own Nazirus, and V'achakach Mayne es Shal Benai. And then he begins to count the Nazirus that he accepted upon himself, the second Nazirus, for this that he will have a son. But what if he said the reverse? First he said, Hareini Nazir kishiyeli ben. I'll be a Nazir when I will have a son. That was the first Nazirus he accepted upon himself. And then he said, Vin Nazir. Also I'll be a Nazir, a separate thing. That is going to be a Nazir in addition to this, for himself, not because of the ben. So now his Chol Mayne Shaloi, so he began counting the 30 days of his own Nazirus that he accepted afterwards, but then afterwards, in the middle, he had a son. So Maniach es Shaloi, he has to stop counting his own Nazirus, or Mayne es Shal Benai, he has to start counting the Nazirus for the Nazirus that he accepted if he has a son. Because now that his son was born, that was the first Nazirus that he accepted upon himself, so he has to start counting the Nazirus for the son that he had. And then he goes back to his own Nazirus to count the Nazirus for himself that he did not connect to his son, because that came second in his the way he accepted his Nazirus, and then he starts counting that Nazirus. Okay, so the Gemara, based on this, will have a bunch of shilas, as we'll see. This Gemara here continues all the way into the next daf, all the way over to the next. Okay, we'll keep it mitzvah for tomorrow.